You're listening to the Career Interrupted podcast. I'm your host, Joy Foster. And today we have a really special guest, someone that I feel very privileged and honored to bring on the podcast. And that's Raynor Winn, the author of The Salt Path. This book is changing lives across the world and has now been turned into a feature film, which is getting a lot of love in the UK and beyond. Raynor, thank you for coming onto the podcast. You have an extraordinary story, and we're going to dive into it a little bit today. I'd like to start by talking about the career interruptions that you've had. I mean, we obviously, those of us who've read the book, The Salt Path, have an idea of some of the career interruptions that you've had. But let's go back to some of your first career interruptions, maybe some that might be relatable to a lot of women who have stopped to have families. Tell us about what it was like when you had your children and what you were doing in your career and how that impacted it.
It's strange, isn't it? As women, we have so many things that interrupt us, and it's really hard to quite hold that path through life. I know when I was a child, I had this vision that I was going to be a writer. I would have a little penguin on the spine of my book, and that was my childhood fantasy. But as a teenager, I realised that wasn't going to happen because I actually needed to earn some money. And so that's the route I took through life. I needed a career in some form, but basically I needed to go and earn some money. So I found numerous jobs in the locality, started filling freezers in the local frozen food shop. And then I worked in a parts department of a garage, where I was in this little cubicle office inside the building with no outside windows, and that was never going to work for me. But then a job came up in the local court, in the magistrate's court, and I found myself working, and I was just working in the fines department, just taking people's payments when they came to pay their fines for parking or some other nonsense. But then this opportunity came up while I was working there full time to study for a degree. It was a law degree. Whilst working full time, I could do this studying remotely. Well, it seemed like such a great idea. Moth and I had been married for a couple of years. We got our first home, and I was just looking for where life could take me. So I started studying for this degree, signed up for it, started work on it whilst working full time on my other job, taking the fines. 1 week into studying, 1 week, I mean, goodness, the timing of it, ridiculous. I realised I was pregnant with our first child. So it was like, okay, I can do this. I can work full time. I can study whilst being pregnant with this surprise baby. And then afterwards, it will all work out because I'll find childcare, it'll all be good. Went through the first year of the degree, had my son. 4 weeks later, did the end of first year exams. All's well, made it through to the second year. Okay, so now I'm expecting the second one. All of a sudden, with this baby, full-time job, studying for a degree, now expecting the second child. I mean, we all, we're women. We all go through this like, how on earth do we juggle everything conversation, don't we? And we all think we can. We all just juggle, don't we? Yeah, so in amongst all that, Moth and I were just living our life. We were renovating our house at the same time. So we had this first little cottage that we'd completely stripped back to bare walls, plaster off, all the plumbing was all hanging out. There was wiring hanging from the walls, because we were working on that in our spare time, because of course we got a lot of that spare time. As well, I was just possessed by the idea that I was going to turn the back garden into a vegetable patch because I was going to be self-sufficient at the same time. So I had dug up by hand with a spade most of the back garden and started planting vegetables. All of this was like all happening at the same time. And so got into the second year of the degree. So I was going away to study remotely for like week blocks at a time, which left Moth at home with a baby, sort of running up to 1 year old sort of thing at this point. And then that wasn't working because he needed to carry on working. Anyway, had the second child, did the second year's exams. And it was suddenly like, okay, so one baby is one thing, two babies, entire other world of of non-stopness. And then suddenly the possibility of sitting down and finding time to write an assignment, to study, to do all those things. I can remember once I'd got a baby in one arm, a law book in the other, a 1-year-old playing down here, whilst, because I thought that was such a good idea in my head, trying to make some clothing for one of the children and listen to something on the radio at the same time. And I can remember thinking, hold on, something's not quite working here. Something has absolutely got to give. Because then it came to the point where I needed to go back to work after having had the second child, whilst trying to juggle all the possibilities of all this studying at the same time. And I realised at that point that even when my pay grade shifted upwards, as it would when I finished studying a degree, it still wouldn't pay for the childcare for 2 babies. And did I actually want to hand 2 babies over to be cared for in some childcare establishment? And it really made me start to reevaluate what I was doing and why I was doing it. Yeah, I mean, those babies hadn't been part of the plan, but now they were my life. And at that moment, the most obvious thing to go was the study. It had to stop. And then I realised that I was going to work to earn enough money to pay for half of the childcare. And then the whole structure of that just fell apart then. And then I just stepped away from work altogether, took care of the babies and grew vegetables.
I think so many women can relate to that, in terms of having to make those choices. And I know it's been a huge issue in the UK in particular, is the cost of childcare and how much money women actually earn. And so much of that money goes to pay for childcare. We have a TechPixie whose husband said, yeah, she could get a job as long as that job paid for the childcare. And if it didn't pay for the childcare, she couldn't get the job, and she had to really make the decision, like, my career or my child. And that was really hard for her, but that was important to her, that she got to do what she wanted to do with her career and still be a mother. And she navigated it, but it was a really difficult choice. I think obviously not everyone has children. Not everyone has to make those choices, but and for some people it's not a choice. They try and have children and they can't, for a woman, this time period in life is so critical, and it had a massive impact on you, as it has on most of our listeners, whether they could or couldn't have children. That what happens next, it affects their career. So obviously that was the first interruption that you had. Tell us about the next interruption, which really forms the basis of your book.
Well, probably actually that second interruption, which was pretty huge, leads on from the first one, because after I made that career choice to not have a career, we started to think, well, actually, we could change the whole way we look at our lives. We could change the whole structure of how we live. And we'd had this dream from when we first met, and I was a teenager then, and by this point I was 30-ish. We'd sort of had this dream that we would find a ruin in the hills, somewhere that we could restore, somewhere where we could live a life on our own terms, live in the way we chose to live, rather than the way that was defined by jobs and timetables and schedules. And I remember I was 30 and we actually found that place. And it was in the hills of Wales. And the walls were falling down and the roof was caving in. But it had some outbuildings that we thought maybe we could do something with. It had some land and it seemed to fit the bill. So with these tiny babies, we just uprooted. Moth gave up his job. We sold our first house. And we just got ploughed into this little vision of what life could be. And it absolutely was everything we thought it would be. We spent the next 20 years of our lives restoring the house, converting the outbuildings into holiday accommodation so people could come and stay with us. And that became our business. It became our main business. But we kept sheep and I carried on growing vegetables and the children grew. I went to university. Yeah, life was good. It's what we created. It's what we wanted it to be. It was like our idyll in the hills. It was absolutely everything we dreamt it would be. And we'd put everything into it, all our time, our effort, money, everything had gone into creating that. But it was working, People came to stay, paid bills. We had this life of freedom that we'd built. But unfortunately, in the background, we'd had this financial dispute with a lifetime friend that eventually ended in a court case. That didn't go according to plan because it saw us being served with an eviction notice from that home. And it was devastating to receive that because it was everything that we'd spent 2 decades building. Absolutely everything. And we thought, this is as bad as life can get. We have just lost 20 years of life, and really the previous 10 as well, because that's where the money to create this had come from. So it's as if our entire life together had just led to us walking out of that door and nothing being on the other side. And we thought that's as bad as life gets. But then in the few days that the court gave us to pack those 20 years of life into boxes and leave, Moth had what we thought was going to be a routine hospital appointment, because for quite some time he'd had a problem with his shoulder, and we thought it had come from when he fell through the roof when we were putting the roof on the barn, and we thought it was just ligament damage, and we thought that's what it was. And we nearly didn't go to the appointment because we had too much to do. We were packing to leave our home. But it was like, who knows when we'll be settled enough to find another hospital appointment. Probably ought to keep it. And we went to the hospital. And I can remember we were sitting in the consultancy room. And very strangely, the doctor came and sat on our side of his desk. And he put his hand on Moth. And just in that moment, I thought, this isn't going to go well. This isn't right. And then he diagnosed Moth with a neurodegenerative condition called corticobasal degeneration. It's a neurological condition that has no treatment and no cure. And it's quite rare, and we hardly know anything about it. And there are very few people that actually have this condition. And he explained how things were not going to get better, how things would get worse, and probably quite rapidly, and there was nothing that could be done about it. And then we left that consultancy room and went back and carried on packing. And we realised in the couple of days that came after that we'd not only lost everything that went before, we'd lost everything that we'd imagined could come after. And that was as if, then what is life then? What is life? Because now suddenly everything that had been had turned into a void, just a big empty space. And there was no understanding or imagination of how it could be anything but a big empty space.
And what I would say in that moment, what were the fears and the doubts? Because I mean, the stakes are the highest. You've lost everything, and you don't know how long your husband's going to be alive. And so what's the thought that's going through your mind?
Panic, mainly. Complete panic and despair, because this was the person I'd met when I was a teenager. I'd looked up across the college canteen and he'd been on the other side dipping a chocolate bar in a cup of tea. And I'd known in that moment as a teenager that this was the person, this was the man I was going to spend my life with. There was no question. I just knew. And I couldn't imagine a day of my life without him in it. But then also, we just lost everything that we had built, everything that structure of life, that structure in which you exist. And it's not just about having a job or where you do the dishes. It's like the entire structure of our life, our business, our income. Every material bit of life was contained in that, but also every emotional bit of it as well. So now we'd lost all of that past, and now we'd lost anything that the future might hold as well, because Moth wasn't going to be in it. And it was just a moment of utter and complete, and just the thought of the past was too choking to allow myself to go there. The thought of the future was almost unbearable. And I remember feeling as if I was trapped in this little bubble between worlds, one that I couldn't bear to think about because I was about to lose it, and another that I couldn't bear to think about because I didn't know what horror it would hold. So it was just like, it was all the horrible anxiety, bitterness, despair, sadness about the past, and nothing but fear for the future. And it was almost too painful to keep breathing.
Yeah, I mean, even as you talk about it, I can feel that, and I can't imagine what it would be like to be facing all of that at the same time, the crushing weight of that. You obviously got through it, but talk about the surprise that really came out of this whole experience for you, because you're not there anymore and it's a distant memory. But what was the surprise that came out of all of this for you?
It came in the last moment, the very last moment before we left the house. We knew that when we walked out of that door, we would be homeless. And what would happen after that, we had no idea. And we were literally standing under the stairs. The bailiffs were hammering at the door. It wasn't that we knew we could change anything. It had gone beyond changing. But we knew that when we stepped out of that door, we would never go back. And the whole of that previous life would be behind us. And we just weren't ready. And the bailiffs were banging at the door, and I was in a state of complete panic. And there were some packing boxes that hadn't gone out of the house. And in the top of one of them, there was a book. And it was a book about a young man who'd walked the Southwest Coast path with his dog. And just in that awful moment, there was just a sense of just walk. We could just fill a rucksack, follow a line on a map, and just walk. And that will give us a purpose. It will give us a reason to go on, to go forwards, to just go into the next day. And I can remember as we walked out of the door, as we opened the door and the bailiff stood on the other side, there was a sense of, actually, it's okay because we're going to walk. It's going to be okay. And we did. And we walked the 630 miles of the Southwest Coast path. And it's a path that has an ascent that's equivalent to climbing Everest nearly 4 times. And makes no sense now. It makes absolutely no sense, because that doctor in the consultant's room said, don't get too tired and be careful on the stairs. And that was the only advice he could give us. But we walked out of that door, filled our rucksacks, and walked 630 miles. It was like Everest 4 times. And that changed our lives. That walk changed everything in every way. And that's, even now I look back on that, and that is the biggest surprise I could ever imagine.
Well, and is that even a bigger surprise than what came after? Is the surprise what happened in that moment, or was it the fact that once you started to write about it and then your daughter read the book and said, you have to publish this, and then that took off? Where was the surprise or were there multiple surprises along the way?
There were multiple surprises, but obviously the biggest one is the book. It was probably nearly 2 years after we finished walking. We'd found some accommodation. Somebody had really kindly offered us accommodation. And Moth had started to study for a degree. And there's something about study. It requires you to be stationary quite a lot of the time. And he'd found a real change in his health as we walked, even though we'd been told it was utterly impossible. As we'd walked about 200 of the 600 miles, we realised that actually he was so much better than he'd been before, so much stronger. And there was a moment where we'd camped on a beach and the tide had come in, and we had to grab the tent fully erected and carry it above our heads and run up the beach and get away from the tide. And I remember as we dropped it at the cliffs, realising that we'd started that walk, and he'd been struggling to put his coat on without help, never mind carry his rucksack. And there, 200 miles in, he'd carried the tent above his head. That was a surprise that the health route wasn't taking the journey that he'd been told it would. But when we stopped walking, his health returned to where it had been before. It deteriorated again really quickly. And he was starting to lose his memories of that time on the path, a time that had been so strong and so powerful for us. So I started to write up the little notes that we'd scribbled in the guidebook and turn that into a narrative of our time on the path, just so that when he read it, he would feel like it was right there on the path, right next to me. And that's all it was. It was a record of our time for him. I remember printing this thing that I'd written. I printed it off on a home printer and tied it up with string and gave it to him for his birthday. And at that point, that is absolutely all that manuscript was going to be. But our daughter was staying with us at the same time, and she read it before he did. And she said, Mum, it's not bad. You probably should do something with it. And, I know I'd had that dream when I was a child that I would have a book. But really, by that point, I was in my 50s. No history of writing anything. No academic qualification to bring forward because I dropped out. Nothing. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Nobody's going to read anything that I would ever write. There's where the surprise came, really. There's the big surprise. The big surprise, because eventually I did Google around and look for an agent, and I found one. And I thought, I'm actually going to sort of like target my search for an agent at women, because I thought probably a woman would understand my story more than a man. They would understand that sense of losing everything, but carrying on anyway, because you've still got your children that still need something from you. You've still got your partner who needs care. I thought, a woman would maybe grasp the story a bit and understand that I had nothing to bring, but I'd still got this story. And because just a few days after sending the 3 chapters and the synopsis, she got in touch and said, can I see the rest of the manuscript? So I sent that off. And within 10 days of sending the first few chapters, she got back in touch and said, we want to represent you.
Wow.
And it went from there, really.
Well, and we were talking before, you said it's now in 26 different languages. And I know it's sold over 2.5 million copies. It's done amazingly well, but it's done so well because it's such a compelling story. And the fact that you've come out the other side, I think, and the fact that it's a true story, I think for me, I love fiction. I love nonfiction. And one of the things that I say to people is the stories in real life are just as good as fiction stories, if not better, and this is one of those cases. I almost didn't pick up the book because I didn't realize it was a nonfiction book. And when I read it, I was just, it was turning the page, because every single moment you were having, you were up against it again and again, and you both came through it. So I'm so grateful that you wrote the story. I'm grateful that your daughter thought you should put it forward. And I'm grateful that you had the courage to do it, because not all women or people in general will take those steps. They might think, who am I? Who's going to publish this, or who's going to like this? And actually to have the courage to put it forward, even though you don't have the qualifications, even though, you've never had a published book before, all those things, is so incredible, because the end result was really life-changing, not just for you, but for people who've read the book as well. What were some of the core life lessons that you've taken away from this experience?
So many, but probably one of the biggest ones is losing all our material things. We build this framework in life, don't we? We gather our stuff, our home, our possessions, and we think that's our life. But actually, when you sit back and look at it, it becomes that our material things control us. They control our life, because they need maintaining, they need upkeep, they need financially providing for, and they become the reason that our lives take the shape they do. So losing that made me realize that actually, without all that material stuff, there's an incredible freedom in life. that just sits behind our stuff. And I don't feel the same about material things as I did before. I've actually now, I think I feel a little bit uncomfortable when I start to be surrounded by too many things. And yeah, I think it's changed completely how I view material stuff completely. But I think much more than that, it's taught me how to live right now. There's a point in the book where I talk about all those anxieties, all those emotions that we had, that we were carrying from what had happened to us, the anxiety, the bitterness, the sadness, everything that had happened to our home. It felt like I was carrying jagged stones in my pockets. And I remember writing that further along, as we walked along those headlands, in that incredible little strip of wilderness between the ordinary world on one side and that endless horizon of the sea on the other. Got a few hundred miles into that walk, it was like I hadn't lost those emotions. They hadn't gone away, but they felt more like sea-worn pebbles that were just, they were still there, but they were just a lot easier to carry. And I think that whole experience on that path taught me that there wasn't much point in looking ahead at what might happen, 3 headlands further along, or 10 miles down the road, or a year into the future, because I didn't know. Because I didn't know what was over that next headland for the physical journey, for Moth's health journey, for anything. I didn't know, and there was no control over what was there either. So it really taught me to appreciate being here right now, taking the next step, climbing the next headland, seeing what the view was from there, and going on from that point. And it taught me to do that, taught me to really appreciate the now in a way I never did before, because I was always looking forward to what would happen when we got a roof on the barn, what would happen when I harvested those vegetables, or when the children went to uni, or when the children left uni. It was always like, what would happen then? How would I plan for what would happen then? But now I realise that what happens then is probably so out of our control, because there are so many undefined little points in life that can come and blindside us, that we can spend all our time focused on planning for what comes next, or feeling regret for what went before that we can't change, that we really don't see the beauty of where we are right now. And I think that's such a waste of life when we don't appreciate the moment that we're in. So it's really taught me to do that. More than anything else, it's taught me to live in today. I'm not saying we all have to do that, but we can lose today in doing that, and that's a big loss.
Well, I think, yeah, what you're describing there is so important, because it's about how much time and energy is spent in your mind on things that are really out of your control in terms of the future and the past, right? I mean, none of us could have predicted COVID was coming, or, there's all sorts of things that we really don't know are going to happen. And what happens with people is, if they don't learn to live in the present and do the things that they can do now, do what they can with what they have, with where they're at right now, then what ends up happening is all of their mental energy goes towards what happened to them in the past, and or what's going to happen to them in the future, and then they lose their agency. And if you can minimize the amount of time that you're spending on the past and the future, you can amplify the amount of time you're spending on right now. What can I do right now? And I think that is really a powerful message. Is there a motto that you live your life by? Did that change throughout this period of time, or did that motto help you get through this period of time? What would you say in terms of a life motto, or something that you live by that is now stronger than ever?
A life model. I think probably before I really did believe in life models. I really thought you can create a structure, you can put yourself into it, and life will be this. I now know that's not true. I now know that there's an awful lot of people out there in the digital world who would like you to think that that's possible, to create a model and live within it. But I think now I understand that life is so much more flexible than that, that life is unpredictable, and that's the beauty of life. That is where the beauty of life lays, is in its unpredictability. But I think my model, if I do have a model for life, is that what matters is the people I love and the world around us that we choose to live within. And for Moth and I, ever since we walked that coast path, we've felt our home is in the natural world. More than any other man-made structure, our home is out there in the natural world, and that is our home. That's the place we can always come back to, the place we always feel strong and we always feel safe. And if I have a life model at all, it's that I do everything I can to encourage everyone else to see this beautiful natural world as home and to care for it as much as we would our front yard or the fence that we paint or the car that we maintain. Without this beautiful natural world we live in, none of the rest of it matters. That's probably my life model.
I love that so much. Well, I appreciate your time coming on today. And of course, we would love for the people listening to this to go and watch the film, The Salt Path, the film version of the amazing bestseller book. And you'll have an opportunity, if you're listening to this, when this podcast comes out, we will be still selling tickets to the Salt Path event that we're going to be running at the UPP, which is the Ultimate Picture Palace in Oxford. And Raynor is going to come to that event, and she's going to host a Q&A with Eleanor Mills, former Sunday Times editor who now runs noon.org.uk, is going to interview Raynor and also give an opportunity to the audience to ask some questions. So we're really looking forward to that event, Raynor. I'm so grateful that you're coming. We've already raised nearly £700 for Crisis, which is a homeless charity, something that we know, homelessness is something that you experience, but also care deeply about. So if you are listening to this and you'd like to come and join us, it's techpixies.com/Salt Path. And we'd love for you to grab your tickets. We've already sold 50% of the tickets, so we expect it to be sold out. So make sure you get your tickets. Bring a friend, bring a spouse. This is the kind of event that you don't want to miss, and you don't want your friends to miss either. So Raynor, thank you so much for coming on. Now, I heard you have another book coming out. You're on your 4th book. Give us a little preview of that, a little teaser of that, because I know I'm definitely signing up in advance to get to get it first.
Yes, I have a new book coming in October the 23rd. It's called On Winter Hill. It has a walk that I took in the middle of winter across the north of England from east to west. Not my best decision because I was up to my knees in snow, -10 degrees. But why was I there alone? That's a big question. Also, really, because the main theme of this book is our connection to the natural world. And is that real? Or is it actually something much deeper that we should be looking for?
Okay, sounds very interesting. I can't wait to read it. Thank you so much for coming on today. And of course, if you want to follow Raynor's adventures, she is on Instagram. It's at Raynor.Winn, Raynor.Winn. Thank you again, Raynor, for coming on. I'm so grateful. And I look forward to meeting you in person on the 10th of July.
Thank you, Joyce. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Well, I hope that warmed your heart as much as it warmed mine. It's incredible to get to spend time with someone who has really gone through the ringer and come out stronger and realize that actually, whatever we might be facing ourselves, we can come through and we can get to the other side. And I also love the other part about Raynor's story, which is as a little girl, she wanted to be an author. She wanted to see the penguin symbol on a book that she wrote. And that dream was meant for her because it still happened for her, probably in a way that she never, ever anticipated or expected. So I want you to really think as you listen to this podcast about that time when you were a little girl, when you maybe had a dream, and what's happened and transpired since then, and whether or not it's time to relive that dream again. And if it's, and maybe it's not, but it's an opportunity to revisit the things that maybe you've always wanted to do in your life that you haven't yet done. And if that's interesting to you, we have something called the 12-day Design Your Dream Life Challenge. And it's 12 days where you really get to explore whether or not, you still have a dream from when you were younger, or whether or not there's a new dream out there that you want to chase or capture or live out. And so if you're interested in that, you can go to techpixies.com/Design DLC 12, which is Dream Life Challenge 12. So techpixies.com/DLC12. And of course, if you want to join me in person with Raynor Winn and Eleanor Mills, that opportunity is coming up on the 10th of July in Oxford, the Ultimate Picture Palace. And it's a private screening with an exclusive Q&A conversation with Raynor Winn. So I hope you come to that. It's going to be a high vibration, high frequency night, and it's going to change and impact lives. I just know it. Thank you for listening to the podcast. We will see you, or you'll connect with us through your favorite podcast distributor on a weekly basis. We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.